Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On today's episode, I am talking to the design writer and lecturer Elizabeth Glickfeld. Elizabeth is the co-founder, along with Anna Bates, of Dirty Furniture, which is this really interesting new type of design magazine that incorporates critical essays with fiction and humor and interviews by examining what happens when, as they say, design leaves the showroom. And they do this by focusing each issue on a specific piece of furniture. She's also written for publications like Design Issues, and Frieze, and was a lecturer in design theory and history at Swinburne University in Melbourne, Australia. In this episode, Elizabeth and I talk about her background growing up in Australia, where she studied literature and graphic design before discovering Ellen Lupton and Abbott Miller's book, Design Writing Research, which actually led her to move to the United States so she could work with Abbott. We talk about how she started writing about design, the origins of dirty furniture, and the challenges that come along with that, and the challenges with design publishing in 2017, as well as the type of design writing that she would love to see more of. I really enjoyed this conversation. I only recently discovered dirty furniture, but was immediately struck with how different it was from all the other design writing that's kind of happening right now, and knew that I needed to get Elizabeth on the podcast. So I'm so glad to have had this conversation and to share it with you. Here is my conversation with Elizabeth Glickfeld. I wanted to start with a little bit of your own background, because I only recently came across your work as I've been immersing myself in design criticism and design writing, and have been talking to more and more people. And somewhere along the way, I stumbled across Dirty Furniture, and I went back and read a lot of your archives, but I don't actually know much about your background kind of beyond that. And so I thought a good place to start would be just a little bit about kind of how you got into design and how you got into writing. And I'm curious specifically, which one of those came first? Kind of design or writing?
I think it's when people ask me these questions, I always sort of think, well, where do I start the story? I mean, I could sort of almost go back to high school, where I sort of always flip-flop between sort of English literature and writing, but I was also always in the art room. Mm-hmm. I ended up doing undergraduates. I did 2 undergraduate degrees. Okay. I did one degree in sort of English literature and art history. And within the context of art history, I remember sort of there being one lecture on Neville Brody in a sort of postmodernism unit, and sort of I guess being immediately transfixed by that story. I just by other means ended up being employed as the editor of my university newspaper in Melbourne. And because it was a position, I was sort of co-editing with a few people, and none of us had any idea about design. I found myself sort of landed with this job of having to design the newspaper, and that also sort of got me interested in graphic design. And after I sort of finished my first degree, I then went and studied graphic design in Melbourne. At the time, wow. There was no such thing as postgraduate design education in Australia at the time.
Okay.
So my only option really was to do undergraduate design twice. Right. I mean, a second undergraduate degree.
Right.
And then I guess, I always think when you're a design student, you sort of, everyone has their particular moment in being a design student. And in Australia, another point to make is because Australia is a very, I guess, outward-looking country. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we have a colonial history, and sort of the Indigenous past is quite sort of difficult, and there is that sort of what we call here a tyranny of distance. It's a very, it's a term in Australia, but it's culturally. Australia always absorbs a lot of influences, and at the time when I was a student, it was sort of the heyday of that sort of 1990s sort of in graphic design, and there was all that sort of ferment and sort of discussions of design authorship.
Right.
And You'll be interested in hearing this, I discovered a book at the time which came out by Abbott Miller and Ellen Lupton,
Oh,
Design
yes.
Right. And I ended up just from being, I guess, completely fascinated and enchanted by that book, and just, I guess, the relationship between design and writing that it sort of kind of proposed and seemed to sort of open up such a big field. I ended up interning for Abbott.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Oh, yes. So
Okay.
I contacted him at the time. He was still at Design Writing Research, and by the time I got to America to do it, because we had to do a year of industry placement as part of my design degree,
Okay.
it was the first year that he was partner at Pentagram.
Okay. I did not know that. You don't have, there's not much of your background online, so I completely missed that. That is
Jared, it
hilarious,
was a
actually.
very long time ago.
Yeah. No, I love that. Because, and it actually answers what my next question was going to be, because I was curious. It's interesting that you have this kind of first undergraduate degree it was in literature, you said?
Yes, literature and art history.
And then you studied design. I was really interested in when those things started to intersect for you. And so it was kind of through design writing research or kind of discovering that book.
I think I've sort of had I've had a career-long interest in the design of writing and the writing of design.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all have this wish that they would intersect. I think part of the career is sort of searching for that intersection.
Right.
But often then, as we know, that distinction between looking and reading is often an either-or relationship.
Right. So how did you start to kind of reconcile those, or how did those, because I imagine, so you worked with Abbott, and then did you kind of continue a design practice?
Then I went home to Australia and I did continue a design practice, but because I mean, you would know from being at design school, at where I studied undergrad design at Swinburne University, there was a very good design history department.
Okay.
But it was always the subject that we had to do it, but it was always the subject that, all the studio practitioners found really difficult and didn't really like. But because I came from that humanities background, I was sort of the nerd who loved it.
Right.
And when we were in studio classes in undergrad, I mean, I still remember, the lecturers, in studio classes, sort of saying to the whole class, everybody stop doing and think, and then they'd single me out and say, you stop thinking and start doing.
Right. Yeah, I know exactly that feeling, actually.
Very different. I guess probably I've had I sort of feel like I really have a feeling for how different studio practitioners are from people who would. It's a very different type of student in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say it's a different kind of thinking through. You think through things by writing, and studio practitioners think through things by making or whatever it is that they do, and it's just I guess it's a different thought process.
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly what my next question was going to be, is I was kind of curious about having that writing background and then going to design school and then working as a designer. Are there things that you took from, kind of studying literature that kind of helped your design practice or gave you a different perspective if you didn't have that writing background?
That's a hard question. I think when I think back, it's funny how you just always remember your undergraduate projects. There were projects which I found quite easy, having had that literature, or not easy, but I found myself more able to sort of, I guess, work through. And in other ways, I found that there were things which a classic design student, which I guess because they thought differently, that I just felt formally there was, if you're with a graphic designer, who just has that sort of formal, I guess, ability and just that sort of sense of agility and sort of nimbleness around a page, which is, I don't know whether you'd call it intuitive. I never felt like I had, I've
Right.
known the graphic designers who might find it very difficult to read, but their sense of space around a page is like a sort of,
Right.
a fifth sense, a sixth sense,
Yeah, that's
which I don't have. That sort of,
you don't have that.
I don't think I do.
Did you
I think as
feel
a don't have that.
did you feel did you I don't know how to ask this. Did you want that, or did you feel like that was important and that you were missing something, or did you feel like kind of
I
what
felt
you were
like I felt like I was searching for it and that I could get there.
okay.
Like had if I had the core of an idea, I could eventually get there and reconcile it. But I think it made the whole process more time consuming for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So when did you start writing about design, or when did those things start to come together in that
When did I? I think I always push, even in, as a student of design history at Swinburne. Look, most of the lecturers who I studied under in Australia are still in that department. Denise Whitehouse, um, Nanette Carter. I think I always push, without realizing it, I always put a lot of effort into my written assignments, even back then, without sort of realizing that I was sort of putting more energy into it probably than everybody else was.
right.
Um, and then having been, having worked for myself a little bit in Australia, and then Denise and Nanette asked me to sort of come back and lecture at Swinburne in design history. I think then I thought, well, if I'm lecturing in it, I should start writing. And I started writing in Australia, but I didn't really, I mean, Australia is, we don't have critical mass. It's a much smaller market. And while there are a lot of burgeoning things culturally happening here, there isn't much of a design press. So I started writing, but not really knowing where I was writing for, or who I was writing for, or what even I was writing for.
Right.
Um, and I think the first piece I wrote was, which I wrote a piece on, I guess, the sort of the cultural backlash against sort of simplicity of graphic design in Australia. It was, there was a lot of the history of, I guess, in Australia there was this sort of uproar every time a corporate company sort of rehashed their corporate identity or
Right.
logo. There was sort of the Commonwealth Bank in Australia, which Ken Cato designed, and then BHB Billiton. And then there was a whole furor over the city of Melbourne, um, also redesigned their logo, and everyone would always be up in arms as to
Right.
why the city was spending money on their corporate identity. So I wrote this piece, sort of, I guess, analysing this prejudice against graphic design, and I think that's sort of what sort of I guess got me back into it. And then, of course, by this time, so we're talking now, um, I guess the mid 2000s,
Okay.
I was in design. There was now postgraduate design had become a thing in this time period in Australia, and I could no longer lecture without a postgraduate degree.
Uh,
That's why I went to the Royal College of
okay.
Art.
Okay. I mean, perfect. You just set up kind of what exactly my next question. I was curious where the decision to go back to school and kind of what you were hoping to get out of that experience. So was it primarily so you could start teaching
Um,
or
I feel
continue
like
teaching, I
fell,
guess?
I fell, I feel like I fell into teaching, and I'm not currently teaching at the moment.
Okay.
But I just, because I was teaching and I couldn't really get further in what I was doing,
Right.
um, I just I felt like even if I wanted to keep teaching, I had to get a postgraduate degree. But then, in order to, I guess, see where design writing could take me, I also needed to get a postgraduate degree.
Right.
And I happened to, I think, um, this all happened around the same time. I would say to my sort of supervisors that I was, always constantly interested in this relationship between design and writing. And at exactly that time, it must have been 2009 or 2010 at this point, and that was at exactly the same time when Decrit started in New York.
Right.
And someone told me they were also starting a similar course at the Royal College of Art. And I spoke to David Crowley, started the course at the Royal College of Art. And I contacted him and I had a Skype conversation with him, and I just knew from speaking to him that it was the right place for me.
And so what were you hoping to kind of get out of that experience, or you know, because if you were kind of already, I don't mean for this to sound like I'm kind of challenging or antagonistic, but if you were already kind of doing a lot of writing, how were you hoping that kind of postgraduate program would further that interest or deepen that interest, or what were you kind of looking for in that experience?
Look, I think I was looking for a sense of community. I felt while I was doing some writing in Australia, I wasn't doing a lot, but I felt like I was definitely, I guess, operating on my own. Not that, I mean, there is a flourishing design community in Australia. But I would say, in most part, the sort of, there was a big emphasis on practice-based. I don't know whether you've heard of practice-based research.
Yeah.
But it comes from more science. So that was more the emphasis on postgraduate education in Australia, and that didn't feel like quite a good fit for me. And I just wanted to, I guess, a part of the appeal of moving to a big city was to, I guess, be in a city where there was this critical mass of design writing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether criticism has to take place where there is this critical mass, or, you know, I don't know, it's always a bit of a double bind because
right.
I guess we find with Dirty Furniture that we would love local writing from different places, but most writers tend to gravitate towards, you know,
right. Yeah. I mean, I'm curious. I'd like to talk more about Dirty Furniture because I think it's a really interesting publication. Did that come out of your graduate studies, or did this come after?
It came so the course critical writing. The course is critical writing in art and design.
Mm-hmm.
We were the first graduating year. Our class of 14 or 15 people. Of those 14 or 15 people, there were about four or five of us who were focused on sort of design and architecture. Everybody else was focused on art, and Dirty Furniture came out of that program when three of us from the course got together and decided we wanted to produce a publication that was design writing oriented.
And how do you just kind of for the listeners or for people who are not familiar with it, how do you describe the magazine or the publication, or what's kind of that pitch for what it is?
Well, our tagline, it's a finite collectible series of 6 issues. Our strapline is "When Design Leaves the Showroom," and each issue takes the theme of a piece of furniture, and we use that piece of furniture as a springboard to explore a lot of different sort of topics, so ranging from design to manufacturing to psychology to history.
Right.
I guess it's about, finding a world in an object.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I'm really curious to talk to you about, because that's what I love about Dirty Furniture. The first, actually, I kind of found out about the magazine before I consciously realized what it was, because I had read Alexandra Lang's piece on tables and power, which I think was maybe the first or second issue.
The second issue, the table issue.
And I just thought that was I love Alexandra, and I've talked to her for the podcast and read everything that she writes, but I really loved that piece because it was a little bit different than what she normally writes, and I think that's kind of indicative of the publication, in that you're using these objects to talk about larger issues,
Yeah.
whether that's politics or power relations or, technology or something. I'm curious kind of how you think about that kind of editorial direction and using, essentially material culture to kind of tell us about, the contemporary condition, I guess.
I think editorially we really try to work from the specific towards the general rather than
Okay.
from the general towards the specific. So um, it's like working from that very small detail, um,
Right.
I guess, outwards into the world rather than the other way around. I guess one of my favorite, when people say something and you wish you'd said it yourself. Um, uh, Rob Alderson, who is the used to be the editor of a magazine called It's Nice That. I
Oh,
don't know whether
yeah.
you, yeah. So I heard him say once that the best editors are both parachutists and truffle hunters,
Okay.
and I think that really encapsulates what I guess we try to do with dirty furniture. On the one hand, sort of presenting this macro view of the object, but then on the other hand, sort of pulling back and having that sort of overarching perspective.
Mm-hmm.
How many different ways can we look at this object? Um, in
Yeah.
what relationships can we adjust it? Um, so I
Yeah.
think that's what we try to do.
I think that's really interesting, and because I feel like that's become one of the big recurring themes of this podcast, and something that comes up again and again when I talk to different people about how, especially in regards to graphic design, so much of it is so much graphic design writing can often be just kind of superficial or kind of surface level, and doesn't, maybe look at the context from which it was created. And so you had mentioned earlier, a bank redesigns their logo, and often a lot of the discussion about it is that it's, been simplified, or they changed the color, or they kern these letters a little bit differently. But, less talked about are the politics or the economics or the cultural conditions that maybe prompted that logo redesign, or the process behind that. And so I'm curious kind of how those types of things fit into the magazine, or is this a thing that could kind of go further and expand beyond even, kind of furniture as a framework?
I think. Look, a lot of people ask us why are we only because we've said from the outset we will only publish 6 issues of
Right.
Dirty Furniture, and people often ask us why, and I guess the reason is because Dirty Furniture itself, it's furniture, it's print.
Mm-hmm.
There's a set of parameters we've set up, and the reason we're only doing 6 is because we might be developing an approach, but there's no saying that approach can't be applied to, other media,
Right.
you know, and
Yeah.
other things. So I guess we are developing an editorial approach, um, and it's not solely tied to furniture. I think also with design processes are very mysterious to people who don't come from design,
Yeah.
and especially graphic design. I mean, people really have, when you're trying to explain graphic designers to non-design, the
Mm-hmm.
process of graphic design to non-designers, it's a, I mean, they they really don't. I mean, they're often interested, but they really don't know.
Yeah, I'm curious, kind of how you think about your audience for both Dirty Furniture and then also your other writing that you do. And I guess I'm going to have a series of questions that I'm just going to throw at you, kind of all at once, and you can answer whatever part you're interested in. But I'm interested in kind of who the audience of Dirty Furniture is, if you have any sense of that, and the types of people that are reading it. But then on the flip side, I'm curious about how you write about something like a design process for an audience that potentially doesn't know anything about it.
So there's two questions there.
Yeah.
Um, The audience of Dirty Furniture, I think what's become really interesting is when we started, perhaps naively, we sort of, I guess, delineated two camps. One, people who might not know about design. So it was a way of, I guess, pointing to design where people who don't come from the design industry might be able to discover it and understand more about it. And B, we sort of thought the magazine would be for designers or people in the design industry themselves. I think what we're discovering, I guess, through the publication of it, is that they are two very different readerships, and I think that's sort of what's interesting because, look, it's very hard to pinpoint, but the articles that we have published, which generally tend to stimulate designers, are very different from the ones
Yeah.
which inspire people who don't know about design.
Yeah, I was curious how you. So does it seem like it's an article by article kind of split? Because I'm something that I'm very fascinated by, and something that I feel like I talk to a lot of people about is how you write about design for a general audience while keeping it interesting for the profession itself.
I think it's really difficult.
Yeah.
I don't. It's something we're exploring, and
Okay.
I'm not sure I have. I mean, do you have thoughts about that? I don't have an answer for it.
No, I don't. I think that's why I probably keep asking people that because I haven't found a good answer. I think the best.
I mean, I can tell you that the one piece that we have published, which designers always point to as being the one that they like the most in Dirty Furniture, and we would never have expected this. One of the things we do in Dirty Furniture is we try to get, I guess, people from other disciplines, so not from design, to write a design piece. So, so for the table issue, we thought, what would happen if we got a philosopher to write about tables? And we approached Federico Campagna, who is sort of quite a well-known philosopher in the sort of, I guess, Italian anarchist tradition. And we sort of gave him carte blanche to write. I mean, we asked him that question, how would you write a piece about tables? And that piece is the one that designers, people in the industry point to as being the one that they find the most sort of interesting and inspiring. I guess maybe designers want to be look, I don't know, maybe designers want to be spoken to in a way that will stimulate their practice.
Yeah. I mean, that was something I've been wrestling with myself, is kind of what is the relationship, or what is the where does design writing or design criticism sit in relation to practice, and is it written so it can stimulate practice or change practice or deepen practice, or is it kind of a reflection, or is it not for the profession, and is it for an audience of the people who are kind of consuming the work of design? And I think that's a really interesting question also, is kind of where the critic or the writer sits in relationship to these things.
I think it needs to be both.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really difficult questions you're asking, and I don't. I mean, there's also the issue of, because I think with Dirty Furniture, and I don't, there is also I guess the academic realm of design, and that's also another very different sort of
right
readership.
Right.
I guess.
Yeah. And I realize that I'm asking these kind of very hard questions. I'm not asking for, the answer.
Open to, offered some interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general consensus is exactly what you're saying, in that there's this kind of scale, and kind of general audience and practitioner are kind of two sides of a scale, and that you kind of have to pivot between both of them, and that criticism that's for the profession and deepens the profession will, in an ideal world, naturally filter out to a general audience, And so if people are writing about design at a very deep philosophical, theoretical level, that could in turn make the consumers of design more visually literate or kind of culturally understand these things as not just decoration. Hopefully, ideally.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something else that I kind of want to pull out for a second before I forget it, about there's also the kind of academic side of all of this also. And something I noticed, I was just before we started talking, I was looking at the Dirty Furniture site and looking at the table of contents of each of the issues, and I was struck by how there were pieces that were kind of labeled humor and fiction and interviews, and that you kind of have these different types of writing all within the issue. And another thing that I've been thinking about a lot is how so much of design writing is very similar, and you don't see a lot of fiction, talking about design or even humor. How do you think about that, or kind of bringing in different writing styles to talk about these things?
We think about it very consciously. I think one of the points of the critical writing course at the Royal College of Art is that it is a department separate from and distinct from what is a very good department in design history. Mm-hmm. So obviously design history has its own place. There is a certain rigor to sort of research methods and ways of writing. But in the space of critical writing, it seems weird that, so much of discussion about design and designing objects and graphic design and practice is about this relationship between form and function. Mm-hmm. And that in the canon of design writing, there seems to be so much scope between, the relationship between, I guess, the meaning you want to achieve and I guess the semantic meaning and I guess the genre of writing that you're writing in.
Right.
And then I guess on top of that, you've got the visual aspect of the writing. Mm-hmm. And I guess if you jostle between those conventions, that's where the, of those sort of three, the visuality right. of the text, the narrative conventions of the text and the meaning, I guess that's where the spaces of interest sort of open up, and we do very consciously consider those in the publishing of Dirty Furniture. We'll often try and get a writer to write in a different narrative voice than they usually do. So I guess in our third issue, in the toilet issue, we got a quite a well-known architecture critic, Owen Hatherley, who usually writes in quite a polemical way. And we asked him to write in first person from a personal point of view. And he wrote a piece about the decline of the public toilet in England from the perspective of the fact that he has Crohn's disease and needs to use a toilet all the time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I guess we very consciously sort of do those experiments of, what would happen if we got that polemical writer to write in first person.
Yeah.
Personal point of view,
Yeah,
those experiments, but that's the space that Dirty Furniture tries to create.
Yeah, that leads into you've again kind of set up my next question for me. But as someone who is publishing a magazine or publishing these kind of 6 issues with these different types of writing, and as someone who has written for a lot of other design publications, I'm interested in both the types of writing that you would like to see more of in the general design discourse, but then also the types of topics that you would like to see more people talking about or writing about, and how, maybe how Dirty Furniture is kind of filling some of those just for your kind of selfish reasons.
I think we'd like to see more long form writing. Anyone from, any subject area in publishing, long form writing is long form writing, and I guess slow what would be known as slow writing or slow journalism. I guess that's the space that we're sort of, trying to create. I guess because with the web, everything is so instantaneous to actually, publish writing that's sort of, and then I guess, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but, one of the questions we get asked, I mean, the guideline for the length of our features is 2,000 words. We'll sometimes publish one that's a bit more. We'll often publish one that is closer to 3,000 words. But then, I mean, any writer knows that that's a really big ask to write.
Yeah.
It's not a 600 to 800 word web review, and that's where you get down to the I guess the economics of it.
Right.
Because and we certainly don't have a solution to the economics of it because we don't think we pay our writers enough.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates with me a lot because I feel like when I started this project, I just kind of had this loose sense that we needed more design criticism or more people talking about design or more design writers. And as I've actually really spent time thinking about it, talking to people about it, I realized that that's not actually what I'm interested in, that there's actually more people talking about design than kind of basically ever before in history, and that anybody to come back to this example, when the bank redesigns their logo, anyone can jump on Twitter and write their initial thoughts. That what I'm actually interested in is that kind of slow, long form design writing.
Yeah. But I guess the issue is that we no longer live in a society where it's the cost of labor, know, and I approached a writer a few weeks ago and she said, I would really love to write a feature for your magazine, but what you're asking will take me 3 weeks and, at least 3 weeks. And she said, I just, and I completely understand that, and as a writer, we're all, as writers, I mean, I am an editor, but, I'm also a writer. We're all in the same position.
Right. Yeah.
The labor of writing is just not compensated in these economic conditions.
Yeah. Do you think that type of writing is possible? And the reason that I ask that is because I'm thinking about how much of design writing is coming from within the design profession also, and that a lot, not all of it, but a lot of it is coming from designers who are also just kind of, writing in their free time. Is there actually a possibility, and kind of, is it economically viable to sustain long-form critical design writing? I don't mean that sounded really dark also. I apologize.
No, but I think it's definitely a valid question, and I think I would like to be clear and transparent at this point and say, we find a way for dirty furniture to sustain itself, but I mean, it doesn't pay us a huge salary. We all have to have other jobs to keep it going.
Right.
And I think we do need to be transparent about these things. Otherwise, we can't critique the system that is sort of become the reality in the sort of publishing industry.
Right.
And I also think another thing which you mentioned, that idea of, this very notion of, if you are a writer, you have to be a writer in your free time.
Yeah.
I think that is the norm for a lot of people, that sort of sense that you write, around the periphery of your life, is a reality for a lot of people. Not for everyone.
Right.
But for a lot it is.
I get, I'm curious, do you do any design work now, or do you consider yourself primarily a writer?
I don't do any design work now.
Okay.
Not because I don't want to. I think just because of the time commitment.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not quick at it. And I enjoy the process of working with graphic designers. That's
I mean,
I really enjoy.
The reason I ask is because I wanted to ask a flip to a question that I asked earlier to kind of start to wrap this up a little bit. But I was curious, earlier I had asked if how kind of being a writer maybe influenced your design process early on. I'm interested now, kind of on the other side of that. Did your work as a designer, do you think that that has any effect on how you think about your writing or your writing process?
I think it definitely. I don't know whether. Oh, I've got a few tangents I can go off
Okay,
on here.
go for it.
Okay, so number one thing I found really interesting about comparing being at design school as a design student versus being, I guess, in a writing course was there was a very stark contrast to me about the way um, the way people critique work. It always seemed to me that in a design school, the second something that was up on the wall, there was no assumption of sort of some sensitive relationship between the designer and his work, and everyone was just objectively trying to, I guess, that traditional model of the architecture or design crit is, I mean, the very tough model is, you pin the work up on the wall and it's open season for,
Mm-hmm. Right.
critique, and, which is the best idea. And being in a writing course, I found that there was, I guess, this presumption of this sort of sensitive relationship between the writer and his or her work.
Right.
There was much more of a sense of having to, um, I guess, there was, maybe it's a sense of authorship,
Right.
sort of behind, yeah. So I think that is sort of one difference. I forgot what question I was answering.
How how your design background has influenced your
Oh,
writing or your
um,
writing process?
I think I don't know whether it influences my writing process. It might in terms of probably in the process before I start writing, like trying to think conceptually about how to structure a piece or what voice a piece should be in, or
Mm.
I guess what the conceit, behind the piece is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I find with writing that I think I write in probably not a very efficient way. I think Sadie Smith has sort of said that there are two kinds of writers: the writers who sort of, write a plan and map everything out in their sketchbook and then write
Right.
to it, and that other person who sort of searches for the beginning for that thread and then sort of goes along it. And
Right.
I would fit into that sort of second category. You
Okay.
know, um,
Yeah.
God help you if you can't find that thread.
Right.
Um, so I guess when I write, there's almost a sense of not knowing what I'm writing about,
Mm-hmm.
but sort of having this sort of, I guess, inner conviction once you find that thread that you have to keep following it.
Right.
Um, but I would say that my experience in graphic design has definitely helped or influenced the way I work with designers in producing a publication.
Okay.
I guess sort of understanding that sort of process, and I guess I'm more open in the role that designers can play in visualizing the writing.
Just to kind of start to, to wrap things up a little bit, I'm you had mentioned earlier that you kind of came to design criticism or design writing during that kind of 90s kind of critical theory boom, and now, and then you were also kind of talking about how in Australia there wasn't much of a design discourse, and now we're kind of talking about how there's like a lot of people talking about design, but long form isn't really sustainable, and kind of how do we manage or navigate that. I'm interested in just your kind of I'd like to hear what you think about just the kind of general contemporary discourse around design, and kind of the state of that, and how that's kind of what you enjoy about it, and also kind of what you're frustrated by.
Oh, that's a hard question.
And we've hit on like some of these things throughout, but I was just kind of
Yeah.
curious as like an overarching thought.
Um, I guess what interests me at the moment, but this is also, I guess, just where I am because of my age and my career.
Oh yeah, that's great too.
Yeah. So I guess like when you're a design student, you go through a period where you're just like greedy for any design book, and
Yeah.
then you go through a period where you're looking for things that aren't design related, which can sort of influence what you're thinking about.
Yeah.
And and I guess things which interest me at the moment are things which I guess bring sort of images and words into sort of a new relationship that I haven't thought about, or objects and words
Mm.
into a new relationship. I mean, I think Kenya Hara and
Yeah.
is it Andrea did an exhibition at Milan 2 years ago called 100 Verbs, New Prehistory.
Oh, okay. I
And
don't think I know this.
so they got 100 artifacts and they matched each artifact to a different verb.
Oh,
And
I
the whole of,
vaguely remember this.
yeah, the whole of, and I just thought it sort of, I guess, really sort of opened up opportunities for, you have, the relationship of exhibition text to the artifact,
Hmm.
and the text really sort of, I think for one of them they had like it was something from Hiroshima. It was like a missile or something, and the verb they put to it was to despair.
Mm.
Um, and I just thought that it just sort of opened up this sort of, I guess, area for this relationship between language and object, and I guess, you know that in Dirty Furniture we sort of, I don't think we've done it enough, but we definitely sort of like to do it more. And I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. My last question is I'm very curious to hear who are the writers that have really influenced you, or the writers you return to again and again, or the people that you're kind of look to for guidance in your own work as a writer about design.
Oh, I think it changes.
Yeah.
There are there are so many. Obviously, I came of age as a designer in the sort of heyday of I magazine,
Hmm.
so you'd have to be Rick Poynter,
Yeah.
because I guess he started new territory. But then someone like, Judith Williamson, who sort of did
Yeah.
some fantastic films which
Yeah.
was, I mean, they were completely design related and sort of just sat in sort of, um, I
Yeah.
think those writers who managed to write about design, but sort of in the popular press where it's ostensibly not even
Right.
labeled as being about design.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I feel that that's been something that's also just come up again and again, is that oftentimes some of the best design writing has like reached a level of cultural consciousness that we almost miss that it even is about design at all. And that's something that's really interesting to me. And so
yeah,
I totally get what you're saying.
I think they're the writers who most inspire me. Those writers who probably wouldn't even call themselves design writers,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that what they're writing about is design.
Right.
And that that sort of, I guess, sort of seamlessly integrate into the popular press.
Hmm.
But then you look back on them and there's this body of work, which is basically a body of design writing.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
I love that.
yeah.
That's great. Thank you. This was so fun and interesting to me. Thank you so much for talking. I'm a
It's my
big
pleasure.
fan. I'm a big fan of your writing. I love what you're doing with Dirty Furniture, and this, I think, this was such a great conversation and great addition to the podcast. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
This episode was recorded on July 24th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.